In 1923, Igor Stravinsky was in exile in a foreign country, cut off from income from his family's lands as well as royalties and residuals from his past compositional work. With a young family to support, he needed to find a source of reliable income, and it was clear to him that he could not simply compose his way out of his financial situation. At the urging of several of his friends, he started to make plans to pursue a side career as a guest conductor and solo performer that would take advantage of the public's taste for the music of the great Russian exile musicians. He would join the ranks of Arensky, Taneyev, Prokofiev, Scriabin, Rachmaninoff, and Rubinstein. But he would have one advantage. None of them enjoyed his reputation as the musical giant who had taken the world by storm with his great Russian ballets. Orchestras throughout Europe and the United States would certainly be interested in programming an evening of music composed, conducted, and performed by the great Igor Stravinsky. Putting this plan into action, however, would require some work. He would need repertoire. A standard orchestra concert consists of an overture or a smaller-scale orchestral work or two, a concerto, and one or two larger works. The orchestral works could be taken from existing pieces, things he had recently composed, or, to avoid problems with copyrights held in the Soviet Union, arrangements of sections of his Russian ballets. In order to offer a complete concert of his music, he needed a concerto that he could perform himself. This was the genesis of the Concerto for Piano and Wind Instruments. The work was composed in Biarritz, France, while Stravinsky was living with a community of Belarusian exiles, and premiered in 1924 at a concert at the Opera of Paris under the baton of Serge Koussevitzky, whose wife is named in the dedication. Over the next 10 years, the piece would be a warhorse in Stravinsky's repertoire, being performed some 40 times before being replaced by the Concerto for Two Solo Pianos of 1933. The work is in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast, using standard orchestral and concerto forms. The first movement is a sonata form with a slow introduction which returns as a coda. The second movement is a 3-part form in which piano cadenzas punctuate the large formal sections. The final movement is a fast, 3-part, sonata-like form. We shouldn't think of this piece as a throwaway, whose only purpose was to provide a vehicle for solo performance during a canned all-Stravinsky concert. As is typical of Stravinsky, he used this piece to explore and develop some significant aesthetic ideas and to further define an emerging neoclassical musical sound. Neoclassicism was still an emerging aesthetic movement, requiring experimentation and exploration of the musical resources on which it would rely, and the techniques that would be used to differentiate it from the musical styles it was replacing and, to some extent, competing against. Neoclassicism is a philosophical movement that arose as a reaction against the perceived excesses of the Romantic era. It sought to reimpose order, form, discipline, and craftsmanship to the compositional process. It further sought to establish a musical language in which all that one needs to understand a work of art is found within that work of art. As such, it sought to distance itself from extra-musical associations through a focus on objectivity. Stravinsky, having enjoyed the successes of his Russian period works, describes the early 20s as the first of 2 musical crises that he experienced in his life. The challenge for the modern composer, however, was in figuring out how to express these new ideals, looking back on musics and forms of the past without regressing to a restatement of the musical idioms of the past. The Concerto for Piano and Wind Instruments represents an early exploration of the neoclassical musical language. One notices immediately the non-traditional instrumentation of the ensemble, piano soloist set against an ensemble of winds, double basses, and timpani. Stravinsky became interested in the sound and capabilities of the piano while working on reductions of his ballet Petrushka for Artur Rubinstein. It was also his personal instrument of choice, as he was often described as doing the bulk of his composing at the piano. The reduction of the orchestra was a means of exploring methods for increasing clarity in the work. Stravinsky expressed that wind instruments better provided the dry, clear sound that would be necessary to not only express the counterpoint of the work, but also to blend with the percussive qualities of the piano and reduce the opportunities for romantic expression of the music. Stravinsky was also exploring the idea that smaller groups of instruments more efficiently expressed greater dramatic impact. Stravinsky had previously explored the possibilities of an all-wind ensemble in his octet of 1923. In the instrumentation of the concerto, he expands from individual wind instruments to choirs of wind instruments working in concert. As you listen to the piece, notice that in most instances, the various groups of instruments stay together, double reeds as a choir, horns as a choir, and other brass as a choir. The formal and thematic content of the work borrows from several sources, including the French overture, Baroque counterpoint, Haydn's symphonic forms, and Beethoven's piano sonatas. Stravinsky also continues his fascination with the sonic resources of ragtime and jazz. The first movement begins with a slow introduction in 3 parts in the style of a French overture. This material is not just a throwaway, as the dotted rhythms and textures show up again in conspicuous ways, both at the end of the first movement and at the end of the third movement. In essence, this material bookends the large formal sections. The final statement of this material, in the third movement, is altered in a small but significant way that brings a sense of closure to the entire composition. The allegro of the first movement follows the expectations of standard sonata form. The first theme is stated clearly and then builds in intensity until the introduction of a curious transitional passage. This transition is the first statement by the piano alone, and it takes the form of a 3-part invention. A second theme, this time exchanging the roles of the piano and the orchestra, concludes the exposition. The development consists of 3 distinct elements: a return to a contrapuntal texture that suggests the first theme material, a return of the second theme material, and a combination of the two, introducing for the first time syncopated ragtime rhythms. A retransition suggests a static, dominant-like harmonic prolongation before propelling the listener into a restatement of the first theme at the beginning of the recapitulation. The recapitulation proceeds like the exposition until the interposition of an extended coda characterized by shifting meter. The material from the slow introduction, this time highly ornamented, returns to finish out the movement. The second movement has a unique and interesting history. The version that we know today is not what Stravinsky originally composed. As it turns out, the original manuscript was lost as it was on its way to the copyist. Stravinsky had to reconstruct the movement from memory, which, he later admitted, resulted in something not too similar to his first attempt. Remembering the second movement seems to have been a general problem for Stravinsky, as he is reported to have had memory slips during 3 performances of the movement, the first time at the premiere. It is reported that there was a delay in starting the second movement because Stravinsky couldn't remember the opening measures. He whispered this to the conductor, who discreetly hummed the first couple of notes, and Stravinsky was then able to continue with the performance. The second movement is slow and lyrical and in 3 parts. The parts are separated by 2 extended cadenzas. The first and last parts bear a striking affinity to each other, enough to label the form as an ABA. The middle section is much more characteristically Stravinskyan in sound, owing to the appearance of layered ostinato patterns of different lengths. The final movement begins with an extended introduction which juxtaposes new thematic material with material from the original slow introduction of the first movement. This leads into the main section of the work, which consists of large, blocky jazz chords and jazz rhythms. The movement builds contrapuntally. There is even a fugato in this part. Until it comes to a sudden stop. A new statement of the original slow introduction from the first movement takes over, bringing a sense of closure to the work through a couple of techniques. The ascending line in the lowest voices that opens the piece, creating the feel of a question, is answered in the final iteration by melodic inversion. The line descends, creating the oral impression of an answer. In addition, where the slow introduction leaves the instrumental group sectionalized and separated, the final statement integrates all of the voices together. We have now heard how Stravinsky consciously conjures sounds and textures from the past in this work. We have heard Baroque counterpoint through a 3-part invention and fugato, jazz rhythms, chords and scoring in the extended thematic section of the third movement, and traditional notions of classical concerto form throughout the work. Writers on this work have made connections to J.S. Bach's Keyboard Concerto in D, BWV 1052, as a possible source of inspiration for the work. The slow introduction of Haydn's Symphony 104 and Beethoven's Opus 13 piano sonata, Pathétique, also suggests an affinity to this work, specifically in how he uses the slow introduction as a thematic and structural element. The implied key structure, A for the first movement, C for the second, and G moving to C for the third, also suggests an awareness of what should be included in a classical concerto. But what specifically makes this piece sound modern and, for lack of a better term, Stravinskyan? The answer lies in the composer's use of tonal language and the subtle ways that he manipulates the ensemble to try to consciously avoid excessive expression. Much of the tonal language of this piece is derived from the half-whole octatonic collection. This pitch collection was attractive to Stravinsky because it not only allowed for a modern sound through its symmetrical division of the octave, but it also contained numerous elements that can strongly suggest tonality. For example, the pitch collection contains both the major and minor triads, the dominant seventh chord, and the dominant minor ninth chord. Stravinsky frequently sets up expectations of tonal resolutions, which he sometimes gives the listener, but rarely in a complete and obvious form. For example, the opening four measures of the piece begin with a statement of an A minor chord, which contrapuntally becomes a split note chord in measure 2. The second half of measure 2 strongly suggests a dominant harmony, but the dominant pitch is missing, and an added G natural creates the split note chord bite. The resolution of this chord is delayed by suspension in measure 3. In measure 4, all of the expected tones resolve except for the F natural, essentially a suspended minor sixth. In other places, Stravinsky establishes an expected resolution, then substitutes a resolution to a pitch or chord a semitone higher or lower. One of the more interesting characteristics of Stravinsky's compositional language is his ability to create certain moods by manipulating performers. Most people who have played Stravinsky are struck now and then by a vague feeling that there were certain things that the composer could have done to make performing the work easier. During his Russian period, these instances were often used to create a sense of increased tension or unsettledness that supports the underlying story of the work. For example, Petrushka is scored notoriously high for virtually the entire ensemble, creating a pained sound that symbolizes the inner emotions of the clown with a troubled soul. The famous bassoon solo that begins The Rite of Spring could have more easily been given to an English horn, but imagine that piece without the strain of that high register passage. Later in the piece, the mixed meter polytonal section of the Dance of the Adolescents is said to have given orchestras of the time a lot of trouble. One noted conductor from a well-known American orchestra is said to have rewritten that passage in 4/4 time with accents to make it playable by his ensemble at its premiere. All of these are examples of Stravinsky asking performers to do extraordinary things for the time in order to keep a very unsettled feel in the ensemble. In her 2012 dissertation, Malia Jade Robertson makes a compelling case for something similar in the piano concerto. With his shift toward a neoclassical language, Stravinsky became very aware of and actively advocated against adding romantic interpretations to music. He felt that all of the emotional and dramatic content that was needed should be composed into the score itself. In short, he came to advocate the role of the performer to not being one of interpreter of the composer's work, for the composer was the true artistic visionary who created it, but rather an executant, faithfully presenting the piece as the composer wished it to sound. In the case of the concerto, Stravinsky seemed especially concerned about creating a work which limited the performer's ability to interpret. He did this first through being specific about things such as articulations, dynamics, and phrasing. Second, he increased the rhythmic complexity. You will notice several instances where members of the ensemble will be playing identical rhythms, offset by an eighth note or a 16th note. For musicians who are trained to listen through the ensemble for rhythmic integrity, this creates a palpable sense of uncertainty that requires additional concentration to place one's rhythms precisely where they need to be. The Concerto for Piano and Winds was an important element of Stravinsky's attempt to create a solo career for himself, and also to establish some of the parameters of his newly developing neoclassical sound. It was to be a sort of musical ambassador for this sound. For 5 years, Stravinsky retained exclusive performing rights for the work for the purpose of establishing the definitive interpretation of it. It is also one of the pieces that he recorded as a piano roll in a four-hand piano reduction, when given the opportunity to record his works for the Pleyel Company in the 1920s. In its early life, the work generally received positive reviews, although many early reviews spent considerable space trying to understand the work in the context of Stravinsky's earlier Russian works and trying to define the composer's new musical language. Performances of the concerto dropped off after Stravinsky replaced it in 1933 with his concerto for two pianos, which he performed regularly with his son Sulema. Relatively few soloists have added it to their repertoire, most likely because of the difficulties in finding orchestras willing to program it due to its non-standard instrumentation. The concerto has continued to have significant influence in the world of collegiate wind band performances. It acted as a centerpiece of a movement to elevate the artistic level of wind band performances throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The concerto today, while not performed as frequently as in the past, continues to give the modern listener a window into one of the most important aesthetic shifts of the 20th century, and stands out as an artifact of a time of musical transition.